Okay, we're about 5 minutes past our nominal start time, so I'm going to recommend we get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Andrina Nicola. Andrina earned her PhD from ETH Zurich in 2018, where she worked with Alexander Rougier. From ETH, she moved on to Princeton, where she is currently a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Astrophysical Sciences. And very exciting news this fall, Andrina will be joining the faculty at the University of Washington in St. Louis in the Department of Physics. So Andrina works really at the intersection of theory and observations and cosmology. Her specialty is really in the kind of self-consistent joint analyses of data drawn from different probes of structure in the universe. So the cosmic microwave background, whether it be from Planck or SPT on the ground, or galaxy surveys like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, and more recently DES and DESI. And as we'll hear about today, this kind of analysis is really exciting, not just for cosmology, but potentially also in constraining baryonic processes like feedback in galaxies. So we're excited to have you here, Andrina, and take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much for the very nice introduction, and thank you everyone so much for giving me the opportunity to give this talk today. Today, I'd like to talk about cosmological probe combination and basically with a focus on how we are trying to basically extend traditional methods to also work for current and future surveys. And before I start, I would like to say that even though it's me who's giving this talk today, the work that I'm going to talk about is the work of many different people. And a subset of those is shown here on this slide. And unfortunately, not everyone fitted on this slide. But I'd like to especially highlight the three fantastic students with whom I have the pleasure to be working with at the moment. Boriana, who's a finishing grad student at Harvard, Ruhi, who's a grad student at Princeton, and Aijan, who's a grad student also at Harvard. So the last 3 decades have seen an immense progress in observational cosmology. I think it's fair to say that cosmology has gone from a rather theoretical towards an experimental, data-driven science, and the fantastic observations that we've seen in the past have led to the establishment of the ΛCDM cosmological model in a way that we can now use this model to fit most of our observational data rather well. And this model is actually remarkably simple, and it relies on 3 key pillars: general relativity as the theory of gravity, the existence of dark matter, and the existence of dark energy, which is this mysterious component giving rise to the accelerated expansion of the universe. Now, in ΛCDM, actually, the universe is dominated by these 2 dark components, dark energy and dark matter, which together make up approximately 95% of the universe's energy density. Now, the problem is, of course, that dark matter has not been directly detected in the laboratory, and we're currently very far away from even understanding what dark energy might be. And so this means that really cosmology offers one of the most promising evidences for physics beyond the standard model, and it really allows us to probe some of the most fundamental questions in modern physics. And in cosmology, our laboratory is very special because our laboratory is actually the entire universe. And we can learn about the universe by observing the so-called cosmological probes. And different cosmological probes allow us to basically investigate the universe at different times in its formation history. And this is illustrated here on this slide, where you can basically see the history of the universe from its beginning to how we see it today. And our earliest picture of the universe we can get by looking at the relic radiation from the Big Bang, which is the cosmic microwave background. And 2 complementary cosmological probes, galaxy clustering and weak gravitational lensing, on the other hand, allow us to probe the more low redshift universe, as you can see here on this slide. Now, all of these probes are very exciting by themselves, but what is even more exciting is the fact that these 2 cosmological probes are actually not separate, because they're all part of our universe that we can only observe through the photons that reach us here on Earth. And this means that any 2 cosmological probes are actually correlated to each other. And as an example, And we can think about the CMB photon that's traveling from the last scattering surface towards us. And this photon is actually going to be deflected by the gravitational potential perturbations caused by the large-scale structure between the last scattering surface and us. And this means that the observed CMB temperature anisotropies are going to be correlated to any tracer of the large-scale structure, such as the galaxy distribution or the weak lensing signal. And this is just an example, but these types of cross-correlations actually exist between any two cosmological probes. And combining cosmological probes is a very powerful way to constrain our cosmological model. And this is due to the fact that different cosmological probes are actually sensitive to different combinations of cosmological parameters. And this means that by combining these probes, we can actually break parameter degeneracies and derive tight constraints on our cosmological model. But this is actually not all, because the cross-correlations between different probes actually carry a wealth of information. First of all, different cosmological probes actually probe different physical fields, and that this means that by computing their cross-correlations, we can actually test the consistency between different physical fields and therefore devise robust tests of our cosmological model. In addition, cross-correlations can allow us to basically constrain astrophysical systematics, such as, for example, the feedback due to baryons. And finally, cross-correlations can be really helpful in identifying or calibrating systematics that would be really difficult to find from the autocorrelations alone. And all of these points make combined probe analyses, taking both auto and cross correlations into account, a very powerful way to analyze both current and future surveys, because these surveys are going to be increasingly dominated by systematic rather than statistical uncertainties. And back in the days when I was doing my PhD, we actually did one of these joint analyses. And we performed a joint analysis of CMB temperature anisotropies, CMB lensing, galaxy clustering, and weak lensing. And we basically computed both the auto and the cross correlations of all of these probes. And the data that we've used in our analysis is shown here on this slide. And without going into too much detail, we're going to go into much more detail of other analyses. What I think is important to take away from this analysis is that it has allowed us to obtain basically constraints on both cosmology and systematics in a self-consistent way. And this analysis was sort of showing what was possible with data that was current at the time when we were doing this analysis. But the fact is that currently cosmology is actually undergoing transformational changes. Current and future surveys are going to give us large amounts of data at a precision that we haven't seen so far. And this is illustrated here on this slide, where you can basically see the exactly same patch of the sky as it has been observed in past surveys, such as SDSS and Planck, which are surveys that we have used in our analysis. And now on the right-hand side, you can see how this patch of the sky is seen using current surveys, such as, for example, HSC, and how we expect it to be seen using future surveys, such as LSST. And you can really see that these surveys are going to give us the opportunity to basically probe cosmic fields at an unprecedented precision. Now, whenever we're faced with the task of analyzing these cosmic fields, what we usually do, and what we've done in our analysis, in our joint analysis as well, is to basically measure their power spectrum. Now, what this amounts to is to take these fields, smooth them, throw away all the information at small spatial scales, and also throw away all the information that's contained in non-Gaussian features of these fields. Now, as it turns out, there's actually a lot of additional information contained in basically small-scale features of cosmic fields as well as their non-Gaussian features. And in order to be able to optimally benefit from the exciting data that we're going to get in the next couple of years, it is really crucial for us to basically try to extract more of this information from our data. And in the following, I would now like to present a couple of projects where we're trying to extend traditional cosmological analyses to take more of this small-scale information into account. And as a first probe, I would like to focus on galaxy clustering. So galaxy clustering is a very exciting and important cosmological probe, and the distribution of galaxies are basically a bias tracer of the underlying dark matter distribution. And this means that by observing the statistical properties of the galaxy distribution in the universe, we can actually go back and infer the statistical properties of the underlying dark matter distribution. And in order to do that, what we can do is to basically measure the correlation function or the power spectrum of these galaxies. And this is nothing else than the correlation of galaxy positions as a function of their distance. Now, since the galaxy distribution is an inherently three-dimensional quantity, this means that we can perform this analysis in two different ways. We can either perform this analysis in full 3D space, or we can take our galaxy distribution, basically slice it along the redshift direction and project all of these redshift slices such that we end up with a bunch of two-dimensional maps, and we can then measure the clustering properties of the galaxy distribution for each of these maps and reconstruct some of the three-dimensional information by looking at all of these two-dimensional power spectra, And this latter approach is called the tomographic analysis, and it's basically the type of analysis I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk. So one survey that is expected to give us a large number of galaxies is LSST Rubin. And within the large-scale structure working group of the Dark Energy Science Collaboration in LSST, we thought that it might be nice to start to prepare for this exciting data by performing a galaxy clustering analysis using current data. And to this end, we've chosen to work with data from the Hyper Suprime Cam or HSC. And the aims of our analysis have been to basically apply and test LSST pipelines on an LSST-like dataset, and also use this analysis kind of like as an excuse to develop these pipelines or parts of these pipelines. We also wanted to test the viability of a tomographic Fourier space analysis for photometric clustering. We wanted to maximize the galaxy sample that we've used in our analysis. So we wanted to see how well we can actually move beyond well understood samples such as LRGs or red magic galaxies. And finally, we wanted to really include small scale information in our analysis and try to see how well we can do that. And so, as we've said, we've chosen to work with data from HSC, and HSC is or was a photometric survey that's mainly focused on weak gravitational lensing. And the survey strategy of HSC is different from the survey strategies of other ongoing photometric surveys in a way that it doesn't cover such a large part of the sky, but it actually goes very deep. And in fact, the depth of HSC is comparable to what we'll expect from LSST. And so HSC is really the ongoing photometric survey that most closely resembles LSST. And most cosmological analyses of HSC that we've seen so far have focused on data release 1, which comprises approximately 150 square degrees that are subdivided into 5 different patches on the sky. And you can see those on the footprint here on this slide. And so in our analysis, we've basically selected galaxies from HSC DR1 and making only very basic data quality cuts, in addition to an I-band and to a magnitude cut at I-band magnitude of 24.5. And this leaves us with approximately 7 million galaxies that cover approximately 80 square degrees on the sky. So the sky fraction of our data is very small, but the number density of our galaxies is very high, meaning that we can really push to small scales. And we further subdivide our galaxies into 4 different redshift bins between 0.15 and 1.5. And you can see the redshift distributions of our galaxies here on this slide. So in a tomographic galaxy analysis, what we're really interested in is the angular distribution of galaxies, basically the distribution of galaxies as a function of their angular position. Now, the thing is that this distribution has the potential to basically, or can be affected by both extragalactic and observational systematics, which have the potential to kind of like incur spurious fluctuations on the galaxy number density as a function of their angular positions. And so in order to basically test for these systematics and also be able to correct for them, we not only create maps of our signal, which is the galaxy distribution, but we also create maps of all the potential systematics that we could think of that could bias our measurement. And as an example, you can see here basically an example of a systematic map from one of our HSC fields. And in this case, it's basically the map of the I-band seeing, which is basically the PSF width in our footprint. And on the bottom, you can see the corresponding galaxy number density map. So once we now have our maps, we can go ahead and basically measure their statistical properties. And we do this by measuring the spherical harmonic power spectrum, CSABL. And we do this using the publicly available code Namaster that has been written by David and Ott. And we measure both the auto and the cross correlations between all of our 4 different redshift bins. And we correct for systematics at the map level by deprojecting all of the systematic maps that we've seen before. And once we have that, we test for residual systematics in our data by basically comparing the consistency between the power spectra that we obtained in all of our different HSC fields. And this is shown here on this slide, where you can basically see the angular power spectra for the different fields that we've obtained in our analysis. Now, these plots here don't really show the power spectra themselves, but they basically show the relative difference between the single field power spectra and their mean scaled by their 1 sigma uncertainties. The diagonal elements of this plot basically show the autocorrelations, and the off diagonals are all the cross correlations between the bins. For all the plots, the x-axis is the angular multipole L. So the larger L, the smaller the scale we're actually looking at, and the y-axis shows these fractional differences. And as you can see, we actually find all of these power spectra to be nicely consistent with each other. And this means that from this test, we do not see any sign for obvious systematics or obvious systematic contamination of our power spectra that would lead to field-to-field variations in these power spectra. So once we've sort of reassured ourselves that we do not see any sign for obvious systematic in our data, we can go ahead and think about how to obtain cosmological information from these measurements. And as we've already seen, HSC is very deep, which means that it's uniquely suited for basically performing galaxy clustering analyses at small spatial scales. Now, the thing is that at small spatial scales, linear perturbation theory breaks down, and we really need to model structure formation, nonlinear structure formation in order to be able to model these scales. And in addition, we also need to model the complex relation between galaxies and the underlying dark matter distribution, which is the galaxy bias. And in our analysis, we've chosen to work with the halo model coupled with the halo occupation distribution. And in this model, basically, we break down galaxy clustering into two distinct regimes. We have the two halo regime and the one halo regime. The two halo regime quantifies basically the relative clustering of galaxies that inhabit two different dark matter halos, whereas the one halo regime, on the other hand, quantifies galaxy clustering within a given dark matter halo. And just very briefly to give you a little bit more details, this slide here illustrates basically the details of our halo occupation distribution model. So we assume a redshift-dependent 6-parameter HOD model, and we separately treat both centrals and satellite galaxies. The distribution of central galaxies is parameterized using two different parameters. We have the minimal mass to host a central galaxy, and we have this parameter that we call sigma LNM, which is basically a softening of this minimal mass threshold. The satellite distribution is parameterized using the mass scale alpha, the minimal mass to host a satellite M0, and the mass scale M1. Now we can expect that the properties of galaxies actually change as a function of redshift. And this is especially important if we think back to the redshift distributions that we've seen a couple of slides before, as our sample actually covers a very broad range in redshift. Now, instead of fitting a different halo occupation distribution to each of our 4 redshift bins, what we do is we basically fit redshift-dependent HOD quantities to all of our data at the same time. And so now that we kind of like have our model, let's look at some of our results. So this plot here now finally shows actually the spherical harmonic power spectra that we've obtained in our analysis, and these are co-added across all of the 5 different HSC fields. The solid line shows the theoretical predictions that we obtained in a joint fit to all of the data. You can also see it subdivided into its 1 and 2 halo term. And as before, autocorrelations are on the diagonal and cross correlations are on the off-diagonal elements. Now, looking at our best fit theoretical prediction, you can see that it's actually quite a good fit to our data. And we especially find that the auto and the cross correlations are actually very nicely consistent with each other. And this is very reassuring because this means that there is no sign for obvious systematics due to photometric redshift uncertainties that would show up as an inconsistency in the auto versus the cross correlations. And in fact, we've done a very simple test where we've kind of like only fitted the autocorrelations and tried to predict the cross correlations from the autocorrelations alone, and also found those predictions to be very nicely consistent with the cross correlations. Again, showing that there's no obvious sign of photometric redshift related systematics in our data. So these data now allow us to basically constrain the halo occupation distribution model of our galaxies, and the contours that we obtain are shown here on this slide, where we basically show the constraints on the redshift-dependent minimal mass to host the central and the mass scale M1. Now, looking at these contours, I don't think is very illuminating, but what is actually quite interesting is to look at the redshift dependence that basically we predict for these quantities using our best fit model. And this is shown here on the two panels here on top, which basically show the redshift dependence of M min and M1 that we obtain from our best fit theoretical model. The solid line shows our best fit, and in order to illustrate the uncertainty, we've also basically shown a sample of 1,000 random realizations from the MCMC. And as you can see, within our error bars, our best fit actually predicts both M min and M1 to be constant in redshift. And this is very surprising because and we would expect at least a mean to increase with redshift, since we would expect that at highest redshifts, only the most massive halos can actually host a central. And this is even more pronounced if we look at the bottom panel, which basically shows the mean host halo mass of our galaxies as a function of redshift. And you can see that our HOD actually predicts this to be decreasing as a function of redshift. And this is really puzzling, and this was basically bugging us for a really long time when we were doing this analysis. And so in order to better understand this, we really need to look at the intrinsic properties of our sample. And this is shown here on this slide, where you can basically see the color magnitude diagram of our galaxies for 10 different redshift bins between 0.15 and 1.5. Now, in this 2D plane, red galaxies basically preferentially live in the upper left corner, since they're red and very luminous, whereas blue galaxies preferentially populate the lower right corner. And now looking at these plots, you can see that as we move to higher and higher redshift, we actually start to preferentially lose red galaxies from our sample. And this turns out to be due to the magnitude cut that we've basically applied to our data. Since the magnitude cut at I-band of 24.5 actually translates to wavelengths smaller than 4,000 angstroms at approximately redshift of 0.9, which means that red galaxies with a strong 4,000 angstrom break actually fall out of our selection, and we therefore end up with a sample that is increasingly dominated by blue galaxies as we move to higher and higher redshift. And it is this selection effect that actually gives rise to both the constant trends for M-min and M1 and the decreasing halo mass as a function of redshift.
Andrina, maybe now would be a good time to pause for one question in the chat.
Oh yeah, sorry, yes, of course.
Yeah, so Robert was asking about non-Gaussian information that's not in the power spectrum. So could you talk about maybe if there are ways to use to get the non-Gaussian information and what you might learn from it?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a great question, and I think this basically leads to the end of my talk. So I think this is basically again just focusing on the Gaussian information that we have in the distribution. But I think we all know that there's a lot of information contained in non-Gaussian statistics. And I personally think that one very promising way to retrieve more of this non-Gaussian information is using simulation-based inference. And I think I'm going to refer probably the rest of my answer to this question just like to the next couple of slides of my talk, if that's fine.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks. And maybe I'll just ask one while you have this slide up, which is that for the lower redshift sources, could you divide this into bins based on the strength of the Balmer break and look at the typical halo mass of galaxies with and without a strong Balmer break, or is the bluer side of the Balmer break not detected even in the lower redshift galaxies, if you see what I mean?
Not exactly.
Okay, I'll think about a better way to ask this and we can come back to it.
No, it's probably me. Shall we?
Yeah, let's continue for now, and yeah, we'll come back to it. Thanks.
Let's chat afterwards. Are there any other questions that I might have missed?
I don't see any in the chat, but if anyone wants to raise their hand, feel free to do so.
Okay, great. So I'll just pull up the last slide on the HSC clustering, which is that like as a last kind of like analysis that we've performed with our pipeline, we've kind of like used the data to obtain a fitting function for the galaxy bias for magnitude limited samples as a function of redshift. And to this end, we've basically taken our sample and subdivided it into 4 brighter samples. And for each of these, we've then again fit an HOD to our samples and basically derived constraints on the linear galaxy bias as a function of redshift. And this is shown here on the left-hand side, where you can see for all of our 5 samples, how the linear bias actually evolves with a function of redshift. And exactly the same is shown on the right-hand side, but here we've multiplied everything with the growth factor. And you can see that the bias that we obtain, follows 1 over the growth factor actually to a very good approximation. And so we use this as an ansatz basically to derive a fitting formula for the bias as a function of redshift and limiting magnitude. And we hope that this might be useful in case you would like to forecast, for example, constraints from magnitude limited samples. In a follow-up analysis, that was led by Baryon, she basically looked at galaxy clustering and weak gravitational lensing from dark energy survey year 1 data. And she basically obtained constraints on cosmological parameters by fitting this data using a very promising model for modeling nonlinear galaxy bias, which is called hybrid effective field theory. And the aim of her analysis was to basically better understand how much more information we can extract if we push the clustering analysis to smaller scales. And this is illustrated here in this plot, which basically shows the constraints on omega m and S8, which is this weird combination of the matter density parameter omega m and the clustering amplitude sigma 8. And in this plot, as we move from the right to left, basically Baryon is including more and more small-scale information into our analysis, and you can really see that including this information actually shrinks cosmological constraints considerably, showing again that there's like a lot of information contained at small spatial scales. And at the moment, we're currently working on 2 other related analyses. So together with Ruhi, we're working on computing galaxy clustering with the 3rd data release of HSC. And this is super exciting because this has covers approximately 3 times the area that we had with DR1. And in addition, within DESC, we're currently working on the so-called bias challenge, where we basically test the performance of different nonlinear galaxy bias models in a joint cosmic shear and galaxy clustering analysis, assuming LSST-like error bars. And the aim of this analysis is to basically come up with a fiducial modeling setup that we can then apply to early data from LSST. Okay, that's as much as I would like to say about galaxy clustering. I don't know, like if you have questions at this point.
Yeah, there's one more from Robert that's relevant here, which is I think it's 2 slides ago now. Could you describe a little bit more why the bias factor should have this dependence on the growth factor?
That's actually a really good question. I'm not sure we actually understand it theoretically, but I'll follow it up. So it's definitely been observed in all types of magnitude limited samples, I think. But I'm not entirely sure if there's a very clear picture, because like the problem with magnitude limited samples is that you start looking at very different samples as you go, as a function of redshift. So I'm not sure if there's a very clear picture on that, but I'll follow up on this. Okay, if that's okay with you, Robert.
Yeah, I think that's good for now. We can come back to it at the end if need be. And I don't see any other questions now, so if you want to move along, that's great.
Great. So in that case, I think I would like to basically take a complete U-turn and talk about another super exciting cosmological probe, which is weak gravitational lensing, and it's actually a probe that lies at the core of many upcoming experiments. And gravitational lensing occurs because photons get deflected as they travel through space-time that has been curved by the gravitational effect of the intervening matter distribution. And this means that if we now go out and look at the images of distant galaxies, we cannot see them how they intrinsically look like, but we're actually going to see them slightly distorted. And in weak gravitational lensing, what one is trying to measure are the tiny but coherent distortions of galaxy images caused by the cumulative lensing effect of the basically large-scale structure between the distant galaxies and us. And the idea is that by measuring the statistical properties of these distortions, we can actually then constrain the statistical properties of the intervening matter distribution. And in practice, we do exactly the same thing as we did before, and we basically measure the correlation of galaxy shapes as a function of their separation. Now, this really means that weak gravitational lensing is a unique probe in a way that it allows us to basically probe the full matter distribution in the universe. So not only the luminous matter, but also the dark matter. And it therefore also doesn't suffer from complications due to galaxy bias. Now, the thing is, however, that the matter power spectrum at small scales is significantly affected by feedback due to baryons, such as, for example, AGN or supernova feedback. And in order to obtain theoretical predictions in this regime, what we do is we basically run a hydrodynamical simulation. We can then measure the power spectrum from these simulations and measure the power spectrum from these simulations. The thing is that at the moment, different hydrodynamical simulations make widely different predictions for the effects of baryons on the matter power spectrum, depending on simulation systematics, such as, for example, their subgrid physics modeling. And this is illustrated here on this plot, which basically shows the ratio of the power spectrum in a given hydrodynamical simulations to their dark matter only counterpart for a bunch of different simulations. And as you can see, these are very different. And so this really means that in order for us to be able to optimally benefit from the exciting data that we're going to see from both current and future experiments, we really need to obtain constraints on the baryon distribution in the universe that we can then use to, first of all, learn about galaxy formation in a cosmological context, and also use to basically to feed back into making our hydrodynamical simulations more accurate. And observationally, we can constrain baryons using several different ways. For example, we can basically observe baryons through their X-ray emission. We can also use the CMB as a backlight and probe baryons through the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect. And finally, a novel probe of the baryon distribution in the universe are fast radio bursts. Now, in the last part that I would like to talk about in this talk, we've kind of like chosen to take a step back and try to answer the question of like how well we can constrain cosmology and baryonic feedback from 2-point functions that underlie some of these observables. And this is a definitely simplifying analysis, but we hope that we can use the constraints that we obtained in our analysis and then feed back and try to see how the single probes can actually constrain cosmology and astrophysics at the same time. And in order to obtain these constraints in our analysis, we've chosen to work with simulations, and specifically, we've used the CAMEL suite of hydrodynamical simulations that has been run by Baco. And CAMELS is a suite of more than 2,000 small volume hydrodynamical simulations that have been run, spanning a vast grid of cosmological models as well as models of astrophysical feedback or baryonic feedback. And in addition, CAMELS has been run using 2 different subgrid physics models, Illustris TNG and SIMBA. And these 2 plots here basically illustrate the differences between these 2 models. And here on the slide, you can basically see the projected electron distribution for Illustris TNG and SIMBA. And you can see that in SIMBA, this distribution is actually significantly more extended than it is in Illustris TNG. And these differences in subgrid physics models actually give rise to large differences in the quantity that we are mostly interested in our analysis. And this quantity is the electron auto power spectrum, PEE. And this slide here shows the electron power spectrum as a function of wave vector k for both Illustris, TNG, and SIMBA. And we basically show the variation or the response of these power spectra to the astrophysical feedback parameter that is mostly sensitive to for each of the two simulation suites. And we actually find that the differences that we've seen before in the electron distribution actually give rise to these responses be driven by significantly different physical effects in both Illustris and SIMBA. And we find, for example, that in Illustris TNG, the electron power spectrum is mostly sensitive to the supernova feedback energy, while in SIMBA, it's actually mostly sensitive to the supernova wind speed. And this means that it's quite hard to basically identify or to translate a given baryonic physics parameter from one simulation to the other. And the first task in our analysis has therefore been to try to identify observable parameters that allow us to quantify the strengths of baryonic feedback in a simulation-independent way. And one very promising quantity to do that is the baryon fraction in halos, as has been found especially by the analysis done by Van Dalen et al. In 2020. And so in our analysis, we wanted to see if this is also the case for camels. And so we did a very simple exercise where we basically trained the neural net to predict the electron density power spectrum from cosmological parameters, as well as F bar as a measure for the strength of baryonic feedback in a given simulation. And the results are shown here on this slide, where the solid lines basically show the power spectra as estimated from the simulations, and the dashed line, on the other hand, show the predictions from the neural net. Now, looking at these plots, you can see that the neural net does a rather decent job at actually predicting the responses of PEE to changes in baryonic feedback. And the differences that are that still remain are due mainly to two different things. First of all, that the baryon fraction definitely doesn't catch all of the information on the strength of baryonic feedback, plus also due to the stochasticity that we have in camels, because they cover only a very small part, very small volume. Now, once we have this, we can now go ahead and basically compute or forecast constraints on cosmology and baryonic feedback using our analysis. And since we've seen that the baryon fraction seems to be very promising to allow us to constrain or to basically quantify the strength of baryonic feedback in a simulation independent way, we don't basically forecast constraints on the camels parameters, but only on F bar and cosmology. And in order to do that, we again do a very simple exercise where we basically train a neural net to predict cosmological parameters and F bar from the power spectra themselves. And the results that we obtain by training this neural network on the electron density auto power spectrum at redshift 0 from Illustris TNG are shown here on this slide. And we find that from this analysis, we can obtain relative constraints on omega m of approximately 7%, while we can constrain F bar to approximately 15%. And this is quite reassuring, especially given the small volume covered by the camel simulations, which means that the immediate question that we need to ask ourselves is, now what are the systematic uncertainties associated to this analysis? And in order to address this question, we actually follow an empirical approach. And we've seen before that in CAMELS, we basically have a simulation suite that has been run using two different subgrid physics models, Illustris TNG and SIMBA. And the constraints that we've seen basically before have been determined by training the neural net on SIMBA. And now the idea is that we can test the robustness of our constraints by evaluating our Illustris TNG trained neural network on SIMBA. And the idea is here that if our constraints are basically robust to the changes in baryonic feedback or to our uncertainties in baryonic feedback as spanned by the differences in Illustris TNG and SIMBA, then we should be able to also recover the cosmological parameters as well as the astrophysical parameters by evaluating our Illustris TNG trained model on SIMBA. If, on the other hand, we detect biases, these serve as a measure for the systematic uncertainties inherent in our analysis. And the results of this exercise are shown here on this slide, where you can basically see that our Illustris TNG trained neural network actually does a pretty decent job at also predicting omega m and f bar in SIMBA, which means that at least within the CAMELS volume, we find that the electron density power spectrum seems to be a very promising probe to allow us to robustly constrain both cosmology and astrophysics. So in the last, okay, sorry. So in the last couple of in this talk so far, we've been basically hearing a lot about LSST, and I would like to take this slide to basically remind ourselves actually what LSST actually is. An LSST is a 10-year optical survey that's going to basically cover all of the southern hemisphere, and it's currently being built, and we expect first commissioning data to arrive approximately in 2023. LSST will be very deep, and it will observe basically billions of galaxies, and it will be focused mainly on weak gravitational lensing and galaxy clustering. And if we now pause for a second and look at these numbers, this really tells us that LSST will be transformational for cosmology, as will be other future surveys such as Euclid or Roman. And this means that these types of surveys are really going to give us large amounts of data at a precision that we haven't seen so far. And this means that in order to be able to optimally benefit from these surveys, we really absolutely need to move beyond traditional methods. And in addition, the high precision of these surveys really means that they're going to be completely dominated by systematic rather than statistical uncertainties. And so the question is now, how do we analyze these surveys? How do we basically develop analysis methods in this completely new regime in cosmology? And how do we extract the rich cosmological information contained in cosmic fields while making sure that we are robust to systematic uncertainties? Now, ideally, what we would like to do is to basically extract the maximal amount of information from these fields. And naively, what we could think of is basically to measuring a lot of, or to extract basically a lot of different features from these fields and then perform inference in a joint analysis of all of these features. Now, this immediately brings up two different questions. First of all, the question is, what features do we pick and where do we stop? And the more problematic question is the fact that as we pick an increasing number of increasingly complex features, it basically becomes impossible to write down a likelihood for this data. And this means that if we cannot write down a likelihood, we cannot actually perform Bayesian inference. And this is a problem, but fortunately, several methods have been developed recently that allow us to actually perform inference without having to write down a likelihood specifically. And these go under the name of simulation-based inference. And simulation-based inference relies on our ability to basically develop or to generate forward models of our data, which are basically synthetic copies of that most closely resemble our data as possible. And the idea of SBI is to basically use these forward models to learn the distribution of our data and then evaluate this distribution and then perform parameter inference on our model parameters by basically evaluating this distribution at the data that we've observed on our telescopes. And these types of analyses have several advantages with respect to traditional analysis that make them particularly suited to current and future surveys. First of all, forward models allow us to retain all of the information contained in cosmic fields, which is not the case for power spectrum analyses that are based on a likelihood, for example. And in addition, forward models actually facilitate the inclusion of systematics because it's usually much easier to forward model systematics rather than to model them theoretically. And this is particularly important for combining cosmological probes, as these very often suffer from potentially complicated and correlated systematics across different probes. And with IJAN, we're currently working on basically applying simulation-based inference to an analysis of galaxy cluster number counts as detected using CNB data. And performing these types of analyses right now, I think, is very important because the data revolution in cosmology is really upon us. And the next couple of years are going to see the start of many exciting experiments over the full wavelength range. And the subset of those is shown here on this slide. And all of these experiments are going to be transformational for cosmology. But what is going to be even more powerful is going to be their combination. And the combination of all of these probes really has the potential to allow us to constrain some of the most fundamental pillars of our cosmological model. And in order for us to really realize this potential, I think it is crucial to move beyond traditional methods using, for example, the methods that we've discussed in this talk here. But it will be equally crucial to ensure the robustness of these novel methods by basically performing more traditional analysis at the same time. And I believe that it's going to be this complementarity in both probes as well as analysis methods that's going to be very useful to help us basically uncover some of the mysteries that the universe is still holding out for us. And this already brings me to the end of my talk. So in this talk, we've seen that combining cosmological probes can be a very powerful way to constrain our cosmological model. We've seen that future surveys will give us a large amount of data at a very high precision, meaning that a lot of information will be contained in small scales and non-Gaussian features, and that these surveys are going to be limited by systematic rather than statistical uncertainties. And we've kind of seen two different approaches of how to deal with these exciting new surveys, either by extending traditional analysis methods or by then moving to more novel analysis methods that can be based on joint forward modeling and simulation-based inference. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thanks very much. So we have time for questions. I see Robert has already beaten us all to the chat with question number one, which is, you mentioned the possibility of using FRBs as a probe. So could you maybe elaborate on this and tell us how this might work?
Okay, so this is like a random idea, and this is actually, as a full disclaimer, the project on the electron density power spectrum that I've presented was actually started as the idea of, can we use FRBs to learn about baryons? So the idea is that the dispersion measure of FRBs actually probes the integrated baryon distribution along the line of sight to the FRB. And so the idea would be to basically use the power spectrum of FRBs to kind of like try to reconstruct the power spectrum of the baryon distribution along the line of sight. But unfortunately, we didn't manage to look into this using camels due to mainly the sample variance issues that I've that I've highlighted a little bit, but that would be the idea of using FRBs to constrain baryons. I don't know if that answers the question though, Robert.
Yes, looks like it does. Okay, I see Adrian has his hand raised. Adrian, you want to unmute?
Hi, well, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I wanted to ask about the last bit about the simulation-based inference. So one of the, like, if you look at like, you know, older, the older literature on, say, likelihood-free inference, like things like approximate Bayesian computation and all that. A lot of that, like, isn't as good with the curse of dimensionality as you know, a traditional, if you could write down the likelihood and doing an MCMC. So could you say a few words about just like what the sort of magic sauce is in some of these more recent efforts that makes it so that it's still very practical for a large number of parameters?
I actually, like, I to be honest, I don't think I have a full answer to this. I think I also feel that it's still under research. I think one thing is definitely that compared to, you know, like basic ABC, for example, which is sort of like accept, reject. Now we have all of these models that allow us to infer the posterior using much less simulations, which is already like a step in the right direction. I think, and these are like basically, for example, the SBI package or Delphi, these kind of things that like kind of like use a neural network or something to estimate the posterior from only a limited sample of simulations. To be honest, I think how this, you know, like scales with the dimensionality of parameter space is actually something that we're trying to investigate a little bit with Aijan. So I'm afraid I don't have a full answer yet, but hopefully we're going to make some progress in that.
Great, thank you.
Robert, go ahead.
I'd like to come back to this idea of doing position space cross-correlation of different samples, and maybe using that to go after primordial non-Gaussianity. Have you thought about that, or has anyone thought about this?
Absolutely. So I think we're actually, one thing that we keep telling us in LSST especially is that we really want to do primordial non-Gaussianity with LSST, because like the sky fraction covered by LSST is so large that I think we will have a really good handle at basically the power spectrum at large angular scales. So I think that's definitely something that LSST will be in a great position to do so. At the moment, unfortunately, we don't have an ongoing project within LSST in order to, you know, like forecast or test how well we will be able to do and you know, like test different methods for obtaining constraints on primordial non-Gaussianity. But if at all you're interested, please let me know. That it would be like fantastic to have that within LSST, I think.
Yeah, I'd be interested in giving some ideas.
That would be great. So in that case, I'm gonna send you a message and have you talk at one of the telecons, if that's fine with you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Okay, can I ask one more question about the stellar feedback stuff? You showed this plot comparing Illustris to Simba, I think. And if I remember right, whichever one was on the right-hand side, the effects on the power spectrum were quite large, even on scales, you know, k less than 1. And that wasn't necessarily the case for the other model, but they were parameterized differently, if I remember right. So is that the kind of thing where the Simba models produce stronger feedback, even holding all else constant? And if so, is that understood, or is this just a parameterization issue?
I think it's due to two different things, I think. One is definitely the fact that Simba has definitely a much stronger feedback model than has Illustris. I mean, I think it has like these, it basically throws out gas in this kind of like sort of like jets, kind of like. And the second thing I think though is that all of these effects are like higher for the Simba for the Camel suite of simulations, because they cover such a small volume. This means that if like you have a very strong feedback effect, for example in Simba, it's going to tend to affect the whole box quite a lot, right? Because like the box is quite small, so possibly the full feedback flow is not entirely converged, which means that I think it's going to enhance the effect of like stronger feedback in Simba even more than you would have in a larger volume simulation. So I think it's...
Okay, that's really interesting, thanks. We are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to recommend we bring things to a close here. But thanks so much again for joining us. That was a really interesting talk. And everyone, please kind of join me in applauding or leaving a note on your way out to thank Andrina for visiting us today.
Thank you so much for having me.